We all take our memories for granted. We assume that the timeline of our lives, our names, our childhood homes, and the faces of the people we love are permanently etched into our brains. We believe that unless we suffer a major medical trauma or reach an extreme old age, our minds are a safe vault. But the reality is that memory is surprisingly fragile. It is just a series of delicate electrical impulses bouncing across microscopic pathways in the dark. And if someone possesses the right kind of technology, the right kind of frequency, and a total lack of human empathy, they can reach into that vault and completely wipe the slate clean. They can turn a thriving, active human being into a blank canvas in a matter of seconds. And what is truly terrifying is that they would not just do this to one person. They would do it to an entire town, just to see what happens when a community loses its collective soul. I am always incredibly fascinated by how far these deep dives travel across the map, so while you are settling in and getting comfortable, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the world you are watching from today. In the early spring of 2024, a 35-year-old investigative journalist named Samuel was looking for a comeback. Samuel had spent the last decade working for major news outlets in New York City, but a series of professional setbacks had left him burnt out and looking for a clean break. He wanted a story that was entirely his own, something raw and uncovered. He found the spark he was looking for in a series of strange, fragmented posts on an obscure dark web forum. The posts mentioned a small, isolated town tucked deep inside the dense pine forests of Oregon, a place called Oakhaven. According to the online rumors, Oakhaven was a town that had completely vanished from official state records in the late 1980s. If you looked at a modern map, the highway simply bypassed the forest entirely, leaving a massive blank space where the town used to be. But the most disturbing detail in the posts was not the administrative erasure. It was the claim that the people living there had suffered a sudden catastrophic psychological event that had left them entirely unmoored from time. Samuel was a natural skeptic, but his journalistic instinct told him there was a thread worth pulling. He packed his camera gear, a stack of blank notebooks, and a digital audio recorder into his rugged SUV and hit the road. He arrived at the edge of the Oregon wilderness on a damp, foggy Thursday afternoon. Finding the town was a logistical nightmare. The old access road was choked with overgrown weeds and blocked by a rusted steel gate that bore a faded sign reading "Property of the Federal Government, Restricted Entry." Samuel was not easily deterred. He parked his vehicle in a hidden clearing, loaded his gear into a heavy backpack, and continued on foot. He hiked for nearly 3 hours through the dense, silent pines, the air growing progressively colder and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Around 4:15 p.m., the thick tree line suddenly broke, and Samuel stepped out onto the main street of Oakhaven. The town looked like a perfectly preserved time capsule from 1987. There were vintage sedans parked along the curbs, their paint faded and tires flat. The storefronts still had neon signs for brands that had long since gone out of business. But what instantly struck Samuel was the absolute lack of decay. The buildings were old, but they were not abandoned. There were clean curtains in the windows, the sidewalks were swept, and smoke was gently curling out of several residential chimneys. Then Samuel saw the people. There were dozens of residents walking along the sidewalks, going about their day in a state of absolute, eerie calm. They were dressed in clothing that matched the era of the town, looking neat and well-groomed. But as Samuel walked down the center of the street, he realized that no one was talking. There were no greetings, no laughter, and no casual chatter. People moved past one another like ships in the night, their eyes fixed straight ahead with a flat, glass-like intensity. Samuel walked up to an elderly man who was sitting on a wooden bench outside a local diner. The man was holding a copy of a local newspaper, but when Samuel looked closer, he saw the text on the pages was completely blank, just white sheets of paper. Samuel cleared his throat and asked the man for the name of the town. The old man slowly tilted his head upward. His eyes were wide and milky, entirely devoid of expression. He stared at Samuel for a long, agonizingly silent 10 seconds before speaking in a low, mechanical monotone. The man said that he did not know the name of this place, and that he had only just arrived. Samuel asked him where he had come from. The man blinked slowly and repeated the exact same phrase, stating that he did not know and that he had only just arrived. Samuel felt a cold spike of unease settle deep in his chest. He turned around and walked into the diner. Inside, a waitress was standing behind the counter holding a clean glass and a wiping rag. She was wiping the exact same spot on the counter over and over again in a perfect rhythmic circle. Samuel walked up and asked her what year it was. The waitress stopped wiping. She smiled a warm, perfectly uniform smile that did not reach her eyes. She told Samuel that the time was 10:30 p.m. Samuel looked at his watch. It was actually 5:42 p.m. When he pointed this out, the waitress simply repeated her answer, her voice maintaining the exact same pitch and tone as if she were reading from an invisible script. Samuel spent the next 2 hours moving through the town, trying to find anyone who could give him a coherent answer. It was a terrifying exercise in futility. Every single person he encountered suffered from the exact same condition. They possessed basic motor skills, they could maintain their appearance, and they could speak, but their minds held absolutely zero information about the past, the future, or their own identities. They were living in a permanent, looping present, entirely stripped of memory. By 7:30 p.m., the sun had dropped below the horizon, plunging Oakhaven into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The town had no streetlights, but Samuel noticed a faint pale green glow emanating from a large, windowless concrete structure that sat on a hill overlooking the residential area. The building looked completely out of place, a brutalist fortress surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Samuel turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick fog as he made his way up the hill. His gut told him that this building was the source of the anomaly. The heavy steel front door was unlocked, swinging open with a long metallic groan as he pushed against it. He stepped inside, his boots echoing loudly against the polished linoleum floor. The air inside the facility smelled strongly of ozone and industrial bleach, a sharp, sterile scent that made his nose burn. He walked down a long, white hallway, guided by the pale green emergency lights overhead. The walls were lined with heavy server racks and electronic equipment that hummed with a low, vibrating resonance that Samuel could feel in his teeth. He eventually reached a heavy security door that bore a small metal plaque. The plaque read Project 7, Cognitive Restructuring Laboratory. Inside the lab, Samuel found a massive control room filled with computer monitors, magnetic tape reels, and diagnostic equipment. In the center of the main desk sat a thick, leather-bound ledger. Samuel walked over, his heart hammering against his ribs, and opened the cover. The ledger was filled with typed government documents dating back to 1987. As Samuel scanned the pages, the terrifying truth of Oakhaven began to unravel. The town had not been the victim of a natural disease or a mass psychological breakdown. It was a test site. The military had developed a high-frequency, subterranean electromagnetic array designed to disrupt the human brain's ability to form and retain memories. They called it Experiment 7. The goal of the project was to create a method of total psychological pacification, a way to neutralize enemy populations without destroying physical infrastructure. The ledger detailed how they had activated the array in the winter of 1987, bathing the entire valley in an invisible, low-frequency pulse. The reports noted with clinical coldness that within 48 hours, the entire population of Oakhaven had lost their pasts, they had forgotten their names, their families, and their crimes. They became perfectly docile, perfectly cooperative, and completely empty. But the final entry in the ledger, dated 2 weeks after the initial activation, was the most disturbing. The lead scientist had written a note expressing a profound sense of horror and regret. He stated that they had tried to turn the array off, but the frequency had locked into a permanent resonance with the iron deposits in the surrounding mountains. The loop could not be broken. The people of Oakhaven were trapped in a permanent circuit of forgetfulness, and anyone who stayed in the valley for more than 12 hours would inevitably fall victim to the same frequency. Samuel felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He checked his watch. It was 8:45 p.m. He had been in the town for nearly 4 hours. He needed to leave immediately. He closed the ledger, grabbed his pack, and turned toward the exit. But as he reached the door of the laboratory, the low, humming sound in the walls suddenly changed pitch. It rose to a sharp, metallic whine that made Samuel's head spin. Every monitor in the control room flared to life, displaying a single scrolling line of text that read, "Experiment 7 active." Samuel stumbled into the hallway, his vision blurring as a piercing headache exploded behind his eyes. He ran toward the front exit, but his legs felt heavy and uncoordinated, as if his brain was struggling to send signals to his limbs. He burst through the front door and collapsed onto the damp grass of the hill, his chest heaving as he looked down at the dark town below. He could see the residents of Oakhaven leaving their homes, walking out onto the dark streets in their pajamas and evening clothes. They were all looking up at the concrete building, their pale faces illuminated by the green glow of the facility. They stood perfectly still in the fog, waiting. Samuel scrambled for his backpack, his fingers fumbling with the zipper. He needed to get to his vehicle. He needed to write this down. He pulled out his digital audio recorder, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He hit the record button, forcing his voice through his clenched teeth. He stated his name, his profession, and his location. He recorded everything he had found in the ledger, desperate to leave a record before the darkness took him. He hiked back into the forest, his flashlight beam swinging wildly through the trees. The walk back felt completely different. He could not remember which path he had taken. Every pine tree looked exactly like the last one, and the silence of the woods felt like a physical wall closing in around him. He stopped, his breathing ragged, and looked down at the audio recorder in his hand. The little red light was still blinking, indicating that it was recording. Samuel lifted the device to his mouth to add more details, but he stopped. He looked at the digital screen. He looked at his own hands. He realized that he did not know why he was holding the device. He looked at the backpack on his shoulders, entirely confused by what was inside it. He turned around, looking back through the trees toward the faint green light on the hill. The headache was completely gone, replaced by a deep, beautiful sense of peace. He felt light, unburdened, and entirely calm. He let go of the audio recorder, letting the plastic device drop softly into the damp pine needles on the forest floor. He did not look back at it. He slowly turned and walked back toward the town of Oakhaven, his eyes wide and vacant, a gentle, uniform smile spreading across his face as he prepared to meet the other residents who were waiting for him in the dark. We spend our entire lives collecting experiences, chasing ambitions, and building an identity that we think defines who we are. We value our material gains and our professional successes, believing they are the anchor of our existence. But we forget that we are only the sum of our memories, and without the context of our past, our regrets, and our loves, we are just empty vessels waiting to be directed. True peace is not found in forgetting the hardships of life, but in having the courage to remember them, because our scars are the only things that prove we were ever here at all. The audio recorder is still sitting out there in the Oregon wilderness, its battery long since dead, holding the final frantic words of a man who no longer exists. I am thinking about heading up to that sector of the Pacific Northwest next month to see if I can find the edge of that valley myself. We will be back with another strange, dark, and mysterious story very soon. Until then, stay safe. When you drive through the pristine, tree-lined suburbs of the American Midwest, you are immediately struck by how uniform and peaceful everything appears. There are perfectly manicured green lawns, white picket fences, and large, beautiful craftsman-style homes where generations of families have raised their kids. We look at these neighborhoods and we assume that the people living inside them are just like the houses themselves, stable, predictable, and safe. But the truth is, suburban architecture is designed specifically to keep the outside world out, which also means it is incredibly effective at keeping secrets in, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not lurking in the deep woods or the dark alleys of a major city. They are sitting right next door, sharing a property line with you, smiling and waving at you across the fence while hiding a reality right beneath their floorboards that would absolutely shatter your understanding of human nature. I am always incredibly fascinated by how far these deep dives travel into the digital wilderness. So while you are getting comfortable, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the country or the world you are watching from today. In the late autumn of 2022, a 38-year-old man named Brian moved into a gorgeous, renovated colonial home on Elm Street in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago, Illinois. Brian was a successful mechanical engineer who had spent the last decade of his life working brutal 60-hour weeks, and this house was his reward. It sat on a massive half-acre lot, flanked by thick oaks that dropped a carpet of deep crimson leaves across his yard. Brian loved the privacy, but more than anything, he loved his neighbors. To his right lived an elderly retired high school history teacher named Arthur. Arthur was a sweet, soft-spoken man in his late 70s who lived completely alone, spent his days tending to his prize-winning hydrangeas, and always wore a faded beige cardigan. He was the quintessential harmless neighborhood grandpa. Because Brian was an engineer, he had a very meticulous mind and a deep obsession with routine. He liked knowing exactly how things worked, and he spent his first few weeks in the house mapping out the plumbing, fixing minor electrical issues, and setting up his basement workshop. His own basement was a standard, clean space with concrete walls and a washer-dryer unit. But because these historic Elm Street homes were built in the early 1920s, they shared an architectural quirk. The basements were incredibly deep, and the heavy concrete foundations were separated by only a thin, shared structural wall underground. By late October, the winter chill had started to settle over Illinois. Brian began spending his evenings down in his basement workshop, restoring old wooden furniture. It was peaceful, silent work. But on a Thursday night, at exactly 11:45 p.m., the silence was broken by a sound that made Brian drop his chisel. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the other side of the concrete wall, directly from Arthur's basement. It sounded like someone was taking a heavy wooden mallet and swinging it against the floor over and over again. Thud, thud, thud. Brian frowned. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to the shared wall, pressing his ear against the cold concrete. The sound stopped the exact second his skin touched the wall. He stood there for 3 full minutes, holding his breath, but the house returned to its absolute silence. Brian shrugged it off, figuring that Arthur was probably just running an old, unbalanced washing machine or maybe fixing a broken pipe in the middle of the night. Elderly people often keep strange hours, and Brian did not want to be the intrusive new neighbor who complained about a minor noise. The next night, however, at 2:12 a.m., Brian was jolted awake in his second-story bedroom. It was not the thumping sound this time, it was a vibration. It felt as if a heavy industrial generator had been turned on right next door, causing the floorboards of his own house to hum with an intense, low-frequency energy. Brian got out of bed, padded down the stairs in his bare feet, and walked down into his basement. The humming was significantly louder down there. It was a deep, guttural resonance that made the water in his laundry sink ripple. He walked over to the shared wall again and as he reached out his hand, he realized the concrete was hot to the touch. Not warm, but uncomfortably hot, as if a massive furnace was blasting directly on the other side. He tapped his knuckles against the wall, intending to make a polite but firm sound to let Arthur know the noise was traveling. The moment his knuckles struck the concrete, the humming cut out instantly. The sudden silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight in the room. Brian stood in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for Arthur to tap back. But nothing happened. The next morning, around 10:30 a.m., Brian saw Arthur out in his front yard raking leaves. He looked completely normal, smiling warmly and waving as Brian walked down the driveway. Brian walked over, intending to bring up the noise in a casual, neighborly way. He asked Arthur if his heating system was holding up okay against the cold, mentioning that he had felt some strange vibrations through the shared wall the night before. Arthur stopped raking. His smile did not fade, but his eyes went completely flat, losing all of their warmth. He stared at Brian for a long, agonizingly silent 5 seconds before speaking in his usual gentle whisper. Arthur said that the old houses on Elm Street have a lot of character, but their old pipes like to sing in the dark. He advised Brian that in a neighborhood like this, the secret to a long, peaceful life is learning to tune out the things that happen underground. Then, without another word, he turned around and walked back into his house, locking the front door behind him. Brian stood on the sidewalk, a cold spike of unease settling deep in his stomach. The phrase turned out the things that happen underground felt less like advice and more like a deliberate, chilling instruction. By the time November arrived, the noises had escalated from a nightly nuisance to a terrifying routine. Every single night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the thumping would begin. It would last for precisely 9 minutes, followed by that intense, burning heat radiating through the concrete wall. Brian stopped sleeping. He became obsessed with the wall, sitting in his basement workshop with the lights turned off, staring at the gray concrete in the dark, waiting for the countdown to begin. He began to notice a smell bleeding through the microscopic cracks in the masonry. It was a sweet, cloying odor that smelled like a mixture of rotten fruit and metallic copper. As an engineer, Brian knew exactly what that smell was. It was the scent of organic decomposition. On a Tuesday night in mid-November, Brian decided he could not take it anymore. He had been tracking the noise for weeks, and his patience had completely evaporated. He was exhausted, paranoid, and consumed by a desperate need for answers. He sat on his workshop stool, watching the digital clock on his phone tick toward the fatal mark. 3:32 a.m., 3:33 a.m. Right on cue, the thumping began. Thud, thud, thud. It was louder tonight, so violent that dust was shaking loose from Brian's ceiling joists. But mixed with the thumping, Brian heard something he had never heard before. It was a voice. It was muffled by the thick concrete, but it was undoubtedly a human voice, high-pitched and ragged, weeping and begging for someone to stop. Brian's blood turned to pure ice. He realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that Arthur was not fixing pipes. He was not running an old washing machine. Someone was on the other side of that wall, trapped in the dark, and they were running out of time. Brian grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling so much he could barely input the emergency sequence. He dialed 911. He forced his voice into a whisper, telling the dispatcher that he could hear a violent assault occurring in the basement of his neighbor's house at 42 Elm Street. The dispatcher told him to stay inside, lock his doors, and wait for the authorities to arrive. Brian stood at his basement window, his eyes glued to Arthur's house. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights reflecting off the bare oak trees. Brian ran out to meet them, his chest heaving as he pointed toward Arthur's basement windows. 2 officers walked up the front steps and began knocking heavily on Arthur's door. It took several minutes before the lock clicked and Arthur opened the door. He was wearing his usual beige cardigan, looking confused, fragile, and utterly harmless. Brian watched from the driveway as the officers explained the situation. Arthur nodded meekly, stepping aside and inviting the officers into his home without a single shred of hesitation. Brian waited in the cold night air, certain that the nightmare was finally over. He expected the officers to come bursting out with their weapons drawn, or to call for backup. But 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Finally, the front door opened, and the two officers walked out. They were not running. They looked completely relaxed, even laughing quietly as Arthur waved them goodbye from the porch. Brian ran up to the lead officer, demanding to know what they had found in the basement. The officer looked at Brian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He told Brian that they had done a thorough sweep of the entire basement. He said there was no furnace, no industrial generator, and certainly no one trapped down there. The officer explained that Arthur's basement was completely empty except for an old wooden workbench and a large, heavy brick pizza oven that Arthur used to bake bread. The officer told Brian that the elderly man was just an old teacher living out his retirement, and that Brian needed to get some sleep and stop harassing his neighbors over the sounds of an old foundation settling. The police cruisers drove away, leaving Brian standing alone in the dark under the cold gaze of Arthur, who remained standing on his front porch. Arthur did not look angry. He just tilted his head to the side, smiled his soft grandpa smile, and raised his hand to give Brian a slow, rhythmic wave before stepping back inside. Brian went back into his house, his mind spinning in a chaotic loop. He knew what he had heard. He knew the heat was real. He knew the smell of decomposition was real. He realized that Arthur was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, a master of deception who had somehow managed to hide an entire chamber of horrors from a pair of trained police officers. Brian went down into his basement workshop one last time. He did not turn on the lights. He walked over to the shared concrete wall, his hands pressing against the surface. It was freezing cold now, the heat completely gone. He realized that the police intervention had changed the game. Arthur knew that Brian was watching. The fragile peace of the neighborhood had been shattered, and there would be a heavy consequence for crossing that property line. As Brian stood there in the absolute darkness of his own basement, he heard a sound that made his breath lock in his throat. It was not coming from Arthur's side of the wall anymore. It was coming from his own side, right behind his back, in the far, dark corner of his own workshop where his old water heater sat. He heard the distinct, rhythmic sound of a heavy wooden mallet being lifted and set down against the concrete floor. Thud, thud, thud. And then a soft, familiar, elderly voice whispered through the dark, thanking him for finally coming down to listen. We spend so much of our lives investing in the illusion of security, believing that a good neighborhood, a friendly smile, and a white picket fence are enough to keep the darkness at bay. But we forget that the people who build the deepest walls are often the ones with the most to hide. And when we go digging into the foundations of our neighbors' lives, we have to be prepared for the reality that we might just become part of the structure they are trying to keep buried. Arthur's yard on Elm Street is still the most beautiful on the block, and the hydrangeas always bloom perfectly every spring. But the new family that moved into Brian's house a few months later has already started complaining to the neighborhood association about a strange, rhythmic thumping that happens right around 3 a.m. I am planning to take a drive down that street next week just to see if the air down there still smells like copper, but until then, I think I will be checking the locks on my own basement door tonight. We will be back with another deep dive into the unexplained very soon. Until then, stay safe.
There is a very specific, undeniable dread that comes with staying in an old hotel. When you walk down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with identical wooden doors, you are walking through a gallery of hidden histories. You swipe your keycard, push open the heavy door, and drop your bags on the floor, rarely stopping to think about who was in that exact room the night before. You do not think about the arguments that echoed off the wallpaper, the quiet tears shed into the pillows, or the tragedies that might have unfolded just inches from where you are about to sleep. Most hotels clean away the physical evidence of the past, leaving only the scent of industrial bleach and fresh linen. But some buildings are too saturated with darkness. No amount of bleach can wash away the heavy, suffocating energy of a place that has seen too much pain. The Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles is one of those places. Before we unlock the doors to one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the winter of 2013. A 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lam had decided to take a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She was from Vancouver, Canada, and she was looking for an adventure. Elisa was a bright, curious, and expressive young woman who documented her life heavily on the internet. She maintained a blog where she wrote about art, fashion, and her personal struggles. She was navigating the difficult transition into adulthood and wanted to see the world on her own terms. Her trip brought her down to Southern California, and she needed an affordable place to stay in the heart of Los Angeles. She found a hostel called Stay on Main. What Elisa likely did not realize was that Stay on Main was simply a rebranded section of the infamous Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, the Cecil was originally designed to be a luxurious destination for wealthy travelers and businessmen. But when the Great Depression hit, the hotel fell on incredibly hard times. The surrounding area, known as Skid Row, became heavily populated by the transient, the desperate, and the forgotten. The Cecil slowly transformed into a cheap, long-term boarding house. Over the decades, it earned a deeply sinister reputation. It became a magnet for tragedy, serving as the final residence for numerous people who chose to end their lives. It was the temporary home to infamous serial killers who walked through the ornate lobby with blood on their hands, unnoticed by the staff. The building was a massive, towering monument to human suffering, holding nearly 700 rooms connected by a labyrinth of confusing hallways, dead ends, and dimly lit corridors. Elisa checked into the hotel on January 26th. Initially, she was placed in a hostel-style room with several other young female travelers. But within a few days, her roommates went to the front desk and complained about her behavior. They said she was acting erratically, leaving passive-aggressive notes on their beds and locking them out of the room. The hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room on one of the higher floors. Elisa was very close with her parents back in Canada. She called them every single day of her trip to check in and let them know she was safe. But on January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel and travel to her next destination, the phone call never came. Her parents waited. They called her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, panic had completely set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Because the area surrounding the hotel was notoriously dangerous, the police took the report very seriously. They dispatched officers to the Cecil Hotel to conduct a search. They knocked on the door of Elisa's private room. There was no answer. When they used a master key to enter, they found a scene that made absolutely no sense. All of Elisa's belongings were still in the room. Her luggage, her clothes, her laptop, and most importantly, her medication were all sitting there. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment to grab a cup of coffee and intended to return immediately, but she was gone. The police began a massive search of the massive, confusing building. They walked down every hallway. They knocked on doors. They brought in specialized search dogs to sniff the corridors. The dogs tracked her scent through the hallways, up to a certain window, and then the scent completely vanished. The police even checked the roof of the hotel. They found that the heavy metal doors leading to the roof were securely locked and heavily alarmed. If anyone tried to open those doors, a loud siren would immediately sound at the front desk. The alarms had not been tripped. There was no trace of Elisa Lam. 2 weeks passed. The story of the missing Canadian tourist hit the local news, but the police had zero leads. It was as if the sprawling, dark hotel had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. Then, in a desperate attempt to gather information from the public, the police released a piece of security camera footage captured inside one of the hotel elevators. They hoped someone might recognize her or notice a clue they had missed. Instead, the video became a viral sensation of pure, unadulterated terror. The footage is deeply unsettling to watch. It is silent, grainy, and stamped with the date February 1st. It shows Elisa walking into the elevator. She is wearing a red zippered hoodie, a casual shirt, and dark shorts. She steps inside, casually leans forward, and presses a column of buttons. She does not press just one button. She presses a series of them, right down the middle row. She steps back and waits for the heavy metal doors to close. But the doors do not move. They stay completely open. Elisa steps forward and looks out into the hallway. Her movements are sharp, jerky, and deeply strange. She peers out to the left, then to the right, moving her head with a bird-like paranoia. She suddenly jumps back into the elevator and presses herself flat against the wall, hiding in the corner as if she is terrified that someone or something is coming down the hallway to get her. A few moments pass. The doors still refuse to close. She steps out into the hallway again. This time, she does a strange, square dance-like step. She steps out, steps back in, steps out again. She is looking at something, but the camera angle only captures the interior of the elevator and a small sliver of the hallway. Whatever she is looking at is just out of frame. She walks out into the hallway, standing just to the left of the open elevator doors. Then she begins to move her hands and arms in a bizarre, unnatural way. She twists her wrists, waving her fingers in the air as if she is treading water or casting a spell. Her hands contort and bend. She is clearly interacting with someone or something, but she is completely alone. Finally, she turns and walks away, disappearing down the dark hallway. The moment she is out of sight, the elevator doors finally, quietly, slide shut. The release of the video sent the public into a frenzy. Millions of people watched it, offering countless theories. Some believed she was being pursued by a killer who was standing just outside the camera's view, holding the elevator button to keep the doors open. Others pointed to the dark history of the Cecil Hotel, suggesting she was interacting with a sinister, invisible entity. Her unnatural hand movements and sheer terror seemed to defy any logical explanation. While the internet analyzed every single frame of the tape, a completely separate and horrifying situation was unfolding inside the hotel. Guests staying at the Cecil began calling the front desk with highly disturbing complaints. They said the water pressure in their rooms had dropped to a mere trickle. When they tried to take a shower, the water that came out of the shower head was completely black. It looked like dark, muddy sludge. As the water ran, the color would eventually clear up, but the smell remained. The guests complained that the tap water smelled pungent, sweet, and metallic. When they brushed their teeth or drank from the sink, the water tasted putrid and completely foul. The complaints grew so numerous that the hotel management could no longer ignore them. On the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker was dispatched to investigate the plumbing. He took the elevator up to the top floor and used a secure stairwell to access the roof of the building. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and gravel. Sitting on top of a raised platform were 4 massive cylindrical water tanks. These tanks supplied the water for the guest rooms, the showers, and the kitchens below. They were huge metal structures, standing over 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The maintenance worker climbed a metal ladder to the top of the platform. He walked over to the first tank. He reached down and unlatched the heavy metal hatch that covered the opening at the top of the tank. He lifted the heavy lid, leaned forward, and looked inside the dark, echoing chamber. Floating face up in the water, inches from the top of the tank, was the decaying, naked body of Elisa Lamb. The worker scrambled backward in absolute horror. He immediately called the authorities. When the police and fire department arrived, the sheer logistics of the scene completely baffled them. The opening of the tank was so small, and the body was so swollen from being submerged in water for nearly 3 weeks, that they had to physically cut a hole in the side of the massive metal tank to drain the water and retrieve her remains. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. The guests inside the hotel realized with absolute terror that for the past 19 days they had been bathing in, brushing their teeth with, and drinking the water that contained a decomposing human body. But the horror of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the impossible mystery of how she got there. The police had checked the roof during their initial search, and the doors were locked and alarmed. To get to the roof without triggering the siren, someone would have had to navigate a complex labyrinth of fire escapes on the exterior of the building, climbing up several stories in the pitch-black night. Furthermore, the water tanks were towering structures. There was no fixed ladder leading from the concrete roof to the top of the specific tank where she was found. To look inside, you had to climb onto a platform, then haul yourself up the slippery, curved metal side of the tank. Once at the top, you had to lift a heavy metal hatch. Inside the tank, police found the red hoodie, the shirt, and the shorts Elisa had been wearing in the elevator video. They were floating in the water alongside her. The public immediately suspected murder. It seemed physically impossible for a petite young woman to navigate the fire escapes, scale an 8-foot water tank, open a heavy metal lid, strip off her clothes, jump into the water, and somehow close the heavy lid behind her. It seemed obvious that someone had chased her down the hallway, murdered her, carried her to the roof, and dumped her body into the tank to hide the evidence. The medical examiner took weeks to conduct a thorough autopsy and toxicology report. When the results were finally released, they provided an explanation that was far more tragic and realistically terrifying than any ghost story or murder plot. The autopsy revealed zero evidence of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Furthermore, the toxicology report came back completely clean. There were no illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. However, the toxicology report did reveal something incredibly important. The levels of her prescribed medication in her bloodstream were extremely low. Elisa Lamb suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Her condition required strict, daily medication to keep her brain chemistry balanced. When she traveled to Los Angeles, the change in routine, the stress of traveling alone, or perhaps a personal decision, led her to stop taking her medication as prescribed. When a person with severe bipolar disorder stops taking their medication, they can fall into a deep, psychotic, manic episode. During these episodes, the brain begins to misfire. The person can experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete break from reality. They might believe they are being hunted. They might believe they have to hide. The haunting elevator video was not a recording of a woman interacting with a ghost or a killer. It was a tragic recording of a young woman trapped inside a terrifying hallucination created by her own mind. The reason the elevator doors did not close was not due to an invisible presence. In her frantic button pressing, she had hit the door hold button, which forces the elevator to stay open for 2 minutes. She was waving her hands and talking to a threat that felt entirely real to her, but existed only in her fractured consciousness. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, she fled the elevator. She navigated the confusing hallways of the Cecil Hotel. She found an open window or a fire escape door that bypassed the roof alarms. Driven by the intense delusion that she needed to hide from her unseen pursuers, she climbed the exterior of the building. She scaled the water tank. She opened the heavy lid and climbed into the water, seeking the ultimate hiding spot. Once she was inside the tank, the water was freezing cold. Hypothermia sets in very quickly in dark, cold water. As the body core temperature drops dangerously low, people often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. The brain becomes so confused by the cold that it suddenly registers extreme burning heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down. She removed her clothes. But the most terrifying realization of all was the water level. When she entered the tank, it was likely over half full. But the tank was essentially a giant metal barrel with smooth, slippery walls. There was no ladder on the inside. As the morning approached and the hotel guests woke up, they began to turn on their sinks and take their showers. As they used the water level inside the tank slowly began to drop. Elisa would have been treading water in the pitch-black darkness, shivering uncontrollably. As the water level sank lower and lower, the opening at the top of the tank moved further and further out of her reach. Her fingers would have scraped desperately against the slick metal walls, finding absolutely nothing to hold on to. She was trapped in an echoing, freezing, dark metal cylinder, screaming for help that would never come, until sheer exhaustion finally pulled her beneath the surface. The lid on top of the tank was likely never closed behind her. The initial reports of the maintenance worker finding the lid closed were corrected during the investigation. He had found the lid open exactly as she had left it when she climbed inside. The story of the Cecil Hotel and Elisa Lam leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound tragedy that strips away the comforting myths of monsters and ghosts, replacing them with the raw, devastating reality of mental illness. It teaches us a subtle, vital lesson about the immense vulnerability of the human condition. A person can be completely surrounded by hundreds of people in a massive hotel located in the middle of one of the most populated cities on Earth and still be entirely, hopelessly alone. It reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying places are not always found in the basements of old buildings or at the end of unlit hallways. Sometimes, the most inescapable prisons are built inside our own minds, waiting quietly for a moment of imbalance to lock the doors. Life requires us to be truly observant, to look past the surface of those around us, because we never know the terrifying battles someone might be fighting in the quiet isolation of their own reality. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. Chicago is a city of 1,000 secrets, but for Elias Thorne, it was just a grid of expensive coffee shops and overcrowded trains that never seemed to arrive on time. At 28 years old, Elias was a freelance graphic designer who lived his life by the flicker of a dual monitor setup, navigating the exhausting hustle of the Midwest urban landscape. Like anyone else trying to make a name for themselves in a town that thrives on ambition, he spent a significant portion of his day scrolling through rental listings, hunting for a miracle that would take him out of his cramped, shared living space and into something he could finally call his own. In the spring of 2024, that miracle appeared on his screen in the form of a studio apartment on the West Side. It was located in a converted industrial building, the kind of place that usually costs a fortune due to its high ceilings and exposed brick aesthetic. However, the price listed was nearly $400 cheaper than anything else in the entire neighborhood. To Elias, it looked like the break he had been waiting for. It was the kind of deal that felt like a reward for all those late nights and skipped meals. Before we dive into the strange reality Elias was about to walk into, I would love to know what part of the world you are currently tuning in from today. Just drop a comment below and let me know your location. When Elias arrived to sign the lease on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was met by the property manager, a man in his late 60s named Arthur. Arthur was dressed in a worn cardigan and moved with a strange, nervous energy. He seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys, barely glancing at the paperwork as Elias signed his name. He did not mention any dark histories, nor did he warn Elias about noisy neighbors or leaky faucets. Instead, he gave one specific and somewhat odd instruction. He told Elias that if he ever heard a humming sound coming from the utility closet near the kitchen, he should not investigate it. He told him to simply turn up his television and ignore it until the sound stopped. Elias laughed it off, assuming it was just a quirk of an old building with temperamental pipes. Elias moved in on a Friday at exactly 2:30 p.m. As he hauled the last of his boxes into the space, he could not help but feel a sense of triumph. The apartment was beautiful. The natural light poured in through the large windows, hitting the brickwork in a way that made the whole place feel warm and grounded. But as he began to unpack, he noticed a small architectural quirk that he had missed during his initial walkthrough. Situated between his bathroom and his bedroom was a narrow wooden door. It had no handle, only a simple deadbolt. It was not labeled on any map, and it certainly had not appeared on the floor plan he had seen online. It looked like an afterthought, a piece of the building that had been walled off or forgotten. He tried to turn the deadbolt once, but it felt stuck, and he quickly lost interest. He figured it was just an old access panel for the plumbing, a remnant of the building's industrial past that no longer served a purpose. For the first 3 weeks, life in the new studio was perfect. Elias was productive, his clients were happy, and he finally felt like he was gaining some momentum. But everything changed on the night of June 14th. At precisely 3:12 a.m., Elias was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that did not belong in his bedroom. It was not a loud sound, but it was persistent. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his bed frame. He looked over at the glass of water on his nightstand and saw tiny, perfect ripples forming on the surface of the liquid. The sound was coming from that small, handleless door. Elias got out of bed, his bare feet feeling the bite of the cold hardwood floor. He felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck as he approached the door. He leaned in and pressed his ear against the wood, expecting to hear the metallic clanking of pipes or the whirring of an old air conditioning unit. But the sound was organic. It sounded like 1,000 people whispering at the exact same pitch, their voices layered over one another in a dense, suffocating blanket of sound. They were all saying the same word over and over again, though the muffled wood made it impossible to decipher the language. Driven by a mix of fear and an intense, irrational curiosity, Elias reached out and gripped the deadbolt. This time, it turned with ease. The metal clicked, and the door creaked open just an inch, releasing a gust of air that smelled like ozone and old, damp paper. Elias expected to see a dark crawl space or a tangle of copper pipes. Instead, he saw a hallway. But it was not a normal hallway. It was an exact replica of the hallway outside his main apartment door, complete with the same gray industrial carpet and beige wallpaper. However, it did not lead to an exit. It stretched out in both directions for what looked like miles, illuminated by a dim, sourceless yellow glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elias grabbed his heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter and checked his watch. It was 3:17 a.m. He stepped over the threshold and into the corridor, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final thud. He walked for what felt like 10 minutes, passing door after door after door. Every single one of them was identical, and every single one had a small plastic sign that read 404. He tried to open one, then another, but they were all locked tight. The silence of the hallway was only broken by the sound of his own breathing and that growing, rhythmic humming. As he continued to walk, he realized the sound was getting louder, vibrating in his very marrow. He felt a sudden surge of panic and turned around to head back to his apartment. But when he looked back, The door he had entered through was gone. In its place was nothing but more beige wallpaper and another door labeled 404. He was standing in a corridor that had no beginning and no end. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to call 911, but his heart sank when he looked at the device. The screen did not show his wallpaper or his apps. It showed a single, static image of a gray circle. There was no signal, no clock, and no way out. He began to run, his footsteps echoing against the endless gray carpet as he passed 100 more identical doors until he finally saw one that was standing slightly ajar. Elias threw his weight against it and stumbled inside, but as he looked around, the relief he expected to feel was replaced by a cold, numbing terror. Elias stood in the middle of the room, gasping for air as he scanned his surroundings. He found himself standing in his own kitchen. To his left, his half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter exactly where he had left it earlier that evening, the bread starting to curl at the edges. His laptop remained open on the small dining table, the screen glowing softly in the quiet room. A wave of intense relief washed over him, so powerful that his knees felt weak. He figured he had somehow looped back around through the strange architecture of the building and found his way home. He walked over to the sink to splash cold water on his face, trying to wash away the lingering smell of ozone and damp paper. But as he reached for the faucet, he noticed something was wrong. The light in the room was not right. It was not the warm glow of his kitchen lamp or the streetlights from outside. It was that same dim, sourceless yellow hue from the hallway. He looked at the clock on his microwave, expecting to see that it was now nearly 4 a.m. Instead, the digital display did not show numbers at all. It showed the words 404. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He slowly turned toward his laptop. The screen was no longer showing his design project. Every file on his desktop, every icon in the taskbar, and every single line of text in his open documents had been replaced with those same 3 numbers. He grabbed the mouse and tried to click, but the cursor remained frozen. He looked toward the large windows that usually offered a view of the Chicago skyline, but there were no city lights. There were no stars. The sky outside was a dull, static gray, like a television tuned to a dead channel. Elias sat down in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that it was painful. He tried to tell himself he was dreaming, that this was some elaborate night terror brought on by stress, but the texture of the wood under his fingers was too real. He stayed there for hours, or perhaps it was days. Time had ceased to function in any way he understood. The sun never rose, and the gray void outside his window never shifted. He realized with a sinking horror that he had not actually escaped the hallway at all. He had simply entered a version of his life that was missing its soul. In the oppressive silence of this hollow apartment, his mind began to drift toward things he had long ignored. He thought about his parents, whom he had not called in weeks because he was always too busy chasing a deadline. He thought about the neighbor he had passed in the elevator a dozen times without ever saying hello. He realized that he had spent so much of his life looking for the next best thing, the cheaper rent, the higher status, and the better job, that he had stopped paying attention to the reality that actually mattered. He had been so impatient to move into this place because of the price tag that he never once questioned why it was so cheap. He had traded his connection to the real world for a bargain, and now the bargain was all he had left. The silence was eventually broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the humming again, but it was no longer coming from behind the wall. It was coming from everywhere. The sound was deafening now, a physical force that made the walls of his kitchen seem to vibrate and blur. He stood up and walked toward the handleless door, which was now standing wide open, revealing the endless yellow corridor once again. As he stood at the threshold, he realized that the rhythmic vibration he had heard earlier was not just a sound, it was a chorus. The thousands of voices he had heard whispering were not speaking a foreign language. They were saying a name, They were saying his name. Thousands of unseen people were calling for Elias, their voices rising in a feverish, synchronized chant that seemed to pull at the very fabric of his being. He looked back at his half-eaten sandwich and his frozen laptop. He had a choice to make. He could stay in this static, digital tomb until his body eventually faded away into the gray. Or he could go back into the hallway. He could keep walking through the yellow glow, hoping to find the version of reality he had taken for granted, the one filled with messy relationships and expensive rent and the sun rising over the lake. Elias took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and old paper once more. He picked up his heavy flashlight, though its beam felt weak against the sourceless light of the corridor. He stepped back through the small door and onto the gray industrial carpet. This time, he did not just leave the door open. He reached back, grabbed the edge of the wood, and pulled it shut. He turned the deadbolt, locking himself inside the hallway with the whispers. He knew that finding his way back would require a level of patience and sincerity he had never practiced before. He had to want to be home, not for the convenience or the cost, but for the life he had left behind. He began to walk, but the hallway was different now. The doors labeled 404 were no longer silent. From behind each one, he could hear the sound of a life being lived. He heard the muffled sound of a television, the clinking of silverware, and the soft laughter of a family. He stopped in front of one door and reached for the handle, but as his fingers brushed the metal, the whispering stopped instantly. The entire hallway plunged into a darkness so thick he could feel it pressing against his eyes. He clicked his flashlight on, but the beam only traveled a few inches before being swallowed by the gloom. Then, from the darkness further down the hall, he heard the sound of a single pair of footsteps, heavy and slow, walking toward him. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps were rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of heavy leather soles striking the industrial carpet with a terrifying weight. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam was useless, flickering as if the darkness itself were draining the batteries. The humming had returned, but it was no longer a distant whisper. It was a roar that seemed to vibrate inside his skull, a cacophony of his own name being shouted by a legion of voices that sounded exactly like him. He began to backtrack, his hands fumbling along the beige wallpaper as he searched for the door he had just locked. But the wall was smooth and unbroken. There was no deadbolt, no handle, and no narrow wooden frame. The hallway had shifted again, sealing him into this airless void with whatever was approaching from the gloom. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of his failing light. Elias held his breath, the smell of ozone and damp paper now so thick it was nauseating. A voice drifted out of the darkness, but it did not come from the figure in the hall. It came from the other side of the wall, to his right. It was a woman's voice, soft and tired, asking if anyone had seen her keys. Then he heard the sound of a child laughing and the distant melody of a radio playing a song he vaguely remembered from his childhood. These were the sounds of the world he had discarded, the reality he had traded for a cheaper life in a studio apartment. He began to pound on the wallpaper with his fists, screaming for help, but his voice felt thin and hollow, as if it were being absorbed by the yellow glow. Suddenly, the darkness ahead of him broke. A figure stepped into the weak glow of his flashlight. It was not a monster or a ghost. It was a man in his late 60s, wearing a worn cardigan. Arthur, the property manager, stood there with a look of profound sadness on his face. He held a ring of keys in one hand and a heavy deadbolt lock in the other. Arthur did not speak. He simply looked at Elias and shook his head slowly, the way one might look at a stray animal that could not be saved. Arthur reached out and placed a hand on the wall where Elias had been pounding, and with a single fluid motion, he turned an invisible key. A door appeared, and Arthur stepped through it, the light of a normal Chicago afternoon spilling into the hallway for a fraction of a second before the door vanished entirely. Elias was left in total silence. The footsteps were gone. The humming had faded into a dull, background thrum. He looked down at his watch, but the hands were spinning backward at an impossible speed. He realized then that he was no longer a person in a hallway. He was a file that had been misplaced, a line of code that had been corrupted. He was the 404 error in the architecture of the universe. According to the police report filed 3 months later, the apartment of Elias Thorne was found perfectly intact. His phone was still plugged into the charger, and his laptop was running, though the screen was nothing but a field of gray static. His half-eaten sandwich remained on the kitchen counter, having long since turned to a thick green mold. There was no sign of a struggle, and no sign that Elias had ever left the room. The investigators noted the small utility door between the bathroom and the bedroom, but when they broke the lock, they found nothing but a solid brick wall that had been part of the original foundation since 1922. Arthur moved a new tenant into the unit just 2 weeks after the investigation went cold. He gave the same instruction about the humming sound near the kitchen, and he made sure to check the deadbolt on that small, handleless door every single night at 10 p.m. As the new tenant signed the lease, Arthur smiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the narrow door in the corner of the room. Once you decide that the value of your life is measured in what you can save rather than what you can give, you might find yourself in a space where nothing is ever truly earned and nothing can ever truly be kept. We are often so eager to find a shortcut to our dreams that we fail to notice when the path leads us away from our own humanity. There is a very specific type of terror that comes from something that simply cannot happen. We are accustomed to tragedy, and we can process violence or accidents because they leave evidence behind. They leave a trail of cause and effect that our brains can understand. But what happens when the physical laws of our reality just seem to break? Imagine a room with only one door. You set up a camera pointing directly at that door. You watch a person walk through that door into the room. A few minutes later, you watch every single person inside that room walk back out. But the person you watched go in is not among them. You search the room, and it is completely empty. Where did they go? Did they dissolve into the air? Did they step into a crack in the universe? Ah. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what happened to a young man in Ohio, in a case that remains one of the most baffling, logically impossible mysteries ever recorded. Before we dive into the impossible vanishing of this young man, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2006. The city was Columbus, Ohio. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old, and on the surface, his life was moving in a brilliant direction. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a bright, handsome, and deeply intelligent young man with a promising future as a doctor. He had a beautiful girlfriend named Alexis, who was also a medical student, and they were deeply in love. In fact, Brian had recently purchased a ring and was planning to ask Alexis to marry him during an upcoming vacation they had booked to Miami, Florida. They were scheduled to fly out on a Monday, just a few days away. But underneath the surface of this perfect life, Brian was carrying a heavy, suffocating weight. Just 3 weeks prior to this story, Brian had lost his mother to a grueling battle with cancer. He had been incredibly close to her, and her death had left a massive, hollow void in his heart. He was trying to hold it together, pushing through his grueling medical exams and keeping a brave face for his family and Alexis. But the grief was a constant, heavy shadow following him everywhere. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, Brian finished his final medical exams for the quarter. It was the beginning of spring break. He and his father went out to dinner that evening. His father noticed that Brian looked exhausted. The late nights of studying, combined with the raw, unprocessed grief of losing his mother, were clearly taking a toll on him. His father told him he should just go home, get some rest, and pack for his trip to Miami. But Brian declined. He said he was going to meet up with his friend and fellow medical student, Clint, to celebrate the end of their exams. He needed a distraction. He needed to blow off some steam. Around 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona. This location is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer impossibility of what was about to happen. The Ugly Tuna Saloona was located inside a large entertainment complex in the University District, but the bar was not on the ground floor. It was located on the second floor of the building. To get into the bar, you had to walk into the ground floor lobby and ride a long escalator up to the second level. At the top of the escalator, there was a small landing and then the main entrance doors leading into the bar. Most importantly, the building was equipped with security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling right outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. This camera continuously panned back and forth, capturing the top of the escalator, the landing, and the front doors of the bar. It was the only public entrance and the only public exit. If you went into the bar, you were caught on that camera. If you left the bar, you were caught on that camera. Brian and Clint started their night at the Ugly Tuna. They had a few drinks, catching up and enjoying the loud, energetic atmosphere of the college crowd. After a while, they decided to do some bar hopping. They left the Ugly Tuna, went back down the escalator, and visited a few other establishments in the immediate area. They drank, they talked to friends, and they tried to drown out the heavy stress of the past few weeks. As the night wore on, they met up with a female friend named Meredith. The three of them continued their night out, eventually deciding to head back to where they started. At 1:15 a.m., early Saturday morning on April 1st, the security camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloona captured Brian, Clint, and Meredith riding the escalator back up to the second floor. The footage shows them clearly. They step off the escalator, walk across the landing, and disappear through the doors into the crowded bar. The bar was incredibly packed. The music was deafening. The air was hot and humid from hundreds of bodies pressing together, and the drinks were flowing. Clint and Meredith found a spot near the bar, but Brian told them he was going to walk around and see if he could find some other friends. He wandered off into the dense crowd, disappearing into the sea of people. Time slipped away. At 1:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before the bar was scheduled to close for the night, the security camera outside the entrance captured Brian once again. The footage shows Brian stepping out of the front doors of the bar. He walks onto the landing near the top of the escalator. He is talking to two young women. They stand there for a brief moment, chatting. Brian looks totally normal. He is not stumbling. He does not look distressed, and he does not seem to be in any kind of danger. He says goodbye to the two women. The women turn and walk toward the escalator to leave the building. Brian, however, does not follow them. The camera clearly shows him turn around, face the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and walk back toward the doors. He steps out of the frame, heading directly back into the bar. At 2 a.m., the harsh, bright, overhead lights of the Ugly Tuna Saloona turned on. The music abruptly cut off. The bartenders started shouting for everyone to finish their drinks and head toward the exit. It was closing time. Clint and Meredith were standing near the front, waiting for Brian. As the massive crowd began to funnel out of the doors and down the escalator, they kept their eyes peeled for their friend. They watched hundreds of college students shuffle past them. The crowd slowly thinned out until the bar was completely empty. The staff began wiping down the tables and sweeping the floors, but Brian never came out. Clint and Meredith checked the bathrooms. They were empty. They walked around the entire second-floor landing. Nothing. Clint tried calling Brian's cell phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and assuming that Brian had perhaps met up with someone else and left without telling them, or simply decided to walk home to his apartment, Clint and Meredith gave up. They walked down the escalator and went home. Saturday morning arrived. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, called him several times, eager to talk about their trip to Miami. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She thought it was slightly strange, but she figured he was just sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. As the day progressed into evening, and Brian still had not returned any calls from Alexis, Clint, or his father, a cold sense of unease began to settle over the family. Brian was not the type of person to completely ignore his phone, especially not with a major trip coming up. By Sunday, the unease had turned into pure panic. Brian had a flight to catch on Monday morning. He had not been home. His car was still parked at his apartment. His luggage was not packed. Monday morning came. Alexis stood at the airport departure gate in absolute agony, watching the passengers board the flight to Miami. She waited until the very last second, praying she would see Brian running down the terminal. But he never showed up. The plane doors closed, and the plane took off without him. At that exact moment, Alexis knew something was horribly wrong. The family immediately contacted the Columbus police and officially reported Brian Schaefer missing. The police launched an investigation, initially assuming this was a standard case of a young man who had perhaps wandered off and gotten into an accident. They requested the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, focusing entirely on the night of Friday, March 31st, and the early hours of Saturday, April 1st. The detectives sat in a dark room. Watching the grainy footage, they saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith ride the escalator up at 1:15 a.m. They fast-forwarded. They watched the footage at 1:55 a.m. They saw Brian walk out, talk to the two women, turn around, and walk back toward the bar entrance. Then, the detectives watched the footage from 2 a.m. until the bar was completely empty. They watched every single person walk out of those doors and go down the escalator. They paused the tape, they rewound it, they watched it again. They focused on every face, every jacket, every gate. Brian Schaefer never walked out. The detectives were baffled. They thought they must have missed something. They implemented a painstaking manual counting process. They counted every single person who went up the escalator that night. Then they counted every single person who came down the escalator. The numbers did not lie. Every single person who went up that night came back down, except for one, Brian. How does a 27-year-old man vanish from a second-floor bar with only one public exit? The police immediately secured the building. They brought in highly trained search dogs. The dogs were given a piece of Brian's unwashed clothing to pick up his scent. The dogs tracked his scent through the ground floor lobby, up the escalator, across the landing, and into the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The dogs wandered around the bar floor, following his path through the crowd. But then, the scent just stopped. The dogs spun in circles, confused. They could not find a trail leading out. It was as if Brian had evaporated into thin air right there on the bar floor. The authorities began to look for alternative exits. If he did not go down the escalator, he had to have left through another door. The only other way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloon was a set of emergency service doors located in the back of the building. These doors were strictly for staff and deliveries. The police investigated the service doors. If Brian had somehow slipped through them without anyone noticing, he would have found himself in a chaotic, highly dangerous environment. The back of the building was a massive, active construction site. It was dark, filled with deep trenches, exposed rebar, concrete pillars, and steep drops. It was a labyrinth of scaffolding and debris. But there was a major problem with this theory. The service doors were not meant for public use. They were heavy, and they opened up to a route that was notoriously difficult to navigate even in the daylight. More importantly, the construction site was heavily monitored by motion-sensitive security cameras to prevent theft. The police pulled every single hour of footage from the construction site cameras for that entire weekend. They watched the tapes, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow, any sign of a person stumbling through the dark. The motion sensors were never tripped. The cameras captured absolutely nothing. Furthermore, police scoured the entire construction zone. They brought the tracking dogs through the debris. They looked down every trench and inside every concrete pipe. They found zero physical evidence that anyone had been there. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no footprints in the mud. The situation was entirely impossible. He did not leave through the front. He did not leave through the back. He was not inside the bar. Desperation set in. Prevent. The police theorized that perhaps Brian had changed his clothes to disguise himself and slipped past the front camera. They meticulously interviewed every single person who was in the bar that night. They tracked down the two women he was seen speaking to at 1:55 a.m. The women confirmed they spoke to him briefly, said goodbye, and left. They had no idea where he went afterward. They checked Brian's bank accounts, his credit cards, and his cell phone records. After the night he vanished, his phone never pinged another cell tower. His credit cards were never swiped. His bank accounts remained completely untouched. He had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The disappearance of Brian Schaefer became a national obsession. It is the ultimate locked room mystery playing out in real life. People analyzed the footage frame by frame, suggesting wild theories. Some believed that Brian, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his mother and the pressure of medical school, had meticulously planned his own disappearance, finding an unseen blind spot in the camera system to escape and start a new life. But his family entirely rejected this. Brian loved Alexis. He was about to propose. He loved his father and his brother. He would never inflict that kind of agonizing pain on them, especially so soon after his mother's death. Others believed he met with foul play inside the bar. They suggested that an altercation occurred in the back rooms, and his body was somehow smuggled out in a trash bin or hidden within the walls of the construction site before the concrete was poured. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete pillars of the new construction, desperate to find an anomaly that might be a human body. The radar found nothing. The ugly Tuna Saloon eventually closed its doors permanently, but the mystery of what happened inside that building continues to haunt anyone who hears it. This story forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about our lives. We spend all our time building foundations. We go to school, we plan vacations, we buy rings for the people we love, and we operate under the absolute assumption that tomorrow is a guaranteed event. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid. But life is an incredibly fragile, unpredictable current. The physical world can shift in ways we cannot comprehend. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the sincerity of our connections. We never truly know when the last time we speak to someone will be. We never know when a simple goodbye will become a permanent silence. The grief that Brian's family endured, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a door to open that remained shut forever, is a stark reminder to hold the people we care about close. It is a reminder to live with patience, to express our love sincerely, and to never let a disagreement linger into the night, because the universe does not owe us closure. It does not owe us an explanation. Sometimes, the people we love the most simply step out of the frame, and we are left staring at an empty room for the rest of our lives. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive, isolated mountain range where a young boy vanished into thin air, only to be found days later miles away, telling a story about a creature that defies every law of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. In the world of content creation, there is a common saying that you are only ever as good as your last video. For a 24-year-old man named Jackson Reed, this was not just a catchy phrase or a bit of industry advice. It was a complete and total obsession that governed every single waking moment of his life. Jackson was the creator and host of a moderately successful YouTube channel called Urban Decay. His brand was built on high-energy explorations of the darkest and most forgotten corners of the Pacific Northwest. He would hike miles into the wilderness or crawl through rusted chain-link fences to show his audience abandoned hospitals, shuttered asylums, and Cold War-era bunkers that had been left to rot for decades. For a few years, he was on top of the world, but by the summer of 2025, Jackson began to notice a terrifying trend in his analytics. His numbers were starting to dip. The audience was getting bored with the same old shots of rusty gurneys and peeling wallpaper. They were demanding something more. They wanted something real, a scare that they could not explain away with wind or settling floorboards, and Jackson was willing to do almost anything to give it to them. Before we get into the heavy details of what happened on that night in August, I want to take a second to ask where you are all hanging out today. Whether you are at home in the suburbs or tucked away in a cabin somewhere deep in the woods, go ahead and drop your city or town in the comments below. On a humid Friday in late August, Jackson decided he was going to take a gamble that would either resurrect his dying channel or end it forever. He had spent weeks poring over old property records and local legends until he found a lead on an undocumented sanatorium hidden deep in the dense forests outside of Spokane, Washington. The locals referred to the place as Blackwood Manor, a massive stone structure that had been abruptly closed down in 1964 following a series of unexplained and devastating fires. Jackson knew that a simple recorded video would not be enough this time. He wanted to do a full live broadcast. He wanted his viewers to see every shadow in real time and hear every creak exactly as he did, so there could be no accusations of clever editing or fake scares. Jackson arrived at the overgrown edge of the Blackwood property at exactly 11:45 p.m. He was heavily geared up for the night, carrying a high-end gimbal for smooth camera work, a powerful satellite hotspot strapped to his backpack to ensure a steady signal, and a pair of industrial-grade flashlights that could cut through decades of darkness. He stood before the looming, charred silhouette of the manor and hit the Go Live button on his phone at exactly midnight. Within seconds, notifications pinged across the globe, and over 4,000 people were suddenly watching him from the safety of their homes. The chat was scrolling so fast he could barely keep up with the sea of fire emojis and messages of encouragement. The only entrance into Blackwood was a jagged, tooth-like hole in the basement wall where the stone had crumbled away. As Jackson crawled through the opening, the temperature did not just drop, it plummeted. Even though the Washington night was thick with humidity, Jackson saw his own breath forming small, frantic puffs of mist in the air. He panned the camera around, illuminating the charred remains of wooden chairs and the carpet of shattered glass that covered the floor like ice. For the first 40 minutes, it felt like a standard exploration. He narrated the history of the facility, pointed out the disturbing graffiti on the walls, and joked with his audience to keep the energy high. But then, at approximately 12:42 a.m., the tone of the chat began to shift in a way that Jackson had never seen before. People were no longer just saying hello or asking where he was. A user with a completely blank profile picture and the generic name Viewer1 started typing very specific and very commanding instructions. This user told Jackson to turn left at the end of the long hallway he was currently walking down. Jackson laughed it off for the camera, playing it up as a bit of fun, but then another user typed that there was something standing directly behind him in the reflection of a cracked mirror he had just walked past. Jackson felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He spun the camera back toward the mirror, but there was nothing there but the reflection of his own flashlight and the empty, dark doorway. However, the chat was absolutely blowing up. Thousands of people claimed they saw a tall, thin figure with no face ducking into a room just as Jackson turned around. He felt a genuine prickle of fear on the back of his neck, the kind that your body gives you when you are being hunted. He looked down at the viewer count and saw it had jumped to over 12,000 people. The numbers were climbing faster than they ever had in the history of his channel. He knew he could not stop now. He was finally giving them exactly what they wanted. He decided to follow the instructions of the chat, letting them become his eyes and ears in the dark. It felt like a high-stakes game, but as he reached the third floor, which had once been the high-security ward, the air began to smell of old copper and wet ash. Viewer 1 typed a final message that stopped Jackson dead in his tracks. The user told him that if he really wanted to see the truth of Blackwood Manor, he had to go to room 309 and lock himself inside. Jackson stood in the center of the third-floor hallway, the heavy silence of the high-security ward pressing against his eardrums like deep water. The instructions from the user, known as Viewer 1, were flickering on his phone screen, a digital command that seemed to carry more weight than the physical walls around him. He looked at the heavy steel door of room 309, which featured a small, rusted slide opening once used to pass food to the dangerously ill. It looked less like a medical room and more like a tomb designed to keep something in rather than help it get well. The chat was a frantic, blurred stream of text, with thousands of people calling him a coward and threatening to unsubscribe if he did not go through with the challenge. Driven by a desperate need to keep his viewer count climbing and to prove he was still the king of urban exploration, Jackson reached out and grabbed the cold iron handle. He stepped into the tiny room, and the heavy door swung shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach churn. The latch clicked into place, a sound that echoed through the small space like a gunshot. He panned his camera around, showing the 12,000 viewers the interior of the room. It was completely empty, except for a single, weathered wooden stool sitting in the far corner. Jackson sat down on the stool, trying to keep his breathing steady for the broadcast. He checked his phone and noticed something technically impossible. Despite being deep within a structure made of thick stone and reinforced steel, his signal was perfect. In fact, it was better than it had been outside. He looked at the chat, expecting to see the usual chaos, but the screen had gone completely silent. No one was typing. The viewer count was frozen at 18,404. The digital world seemed to have stopped breathing right along with him. Then, at exactly 1:26 a.m., the screen on his phone began to flicker violently, the colors bleeding and distorting until the live feed changed entirely. Jackson realized with a jolt of horror that he was no longer looking at the selfie view of his own face. He was looking at a video of himself sitting on the wooden stool, but the camera angle was from the high ceiling corner of the room. He slowly looked up, his heart hammering against his ribs, but there was no camera in the corner. There was nothing but cracked plaster and shadows. He rushed to the door and grabbed the handle, pulling with everything he had, but it would not budge. He began to yell for help, but his own voice sounded muffled and distant to his ears, as if he were shouting from underwater. He looked back down at the phone in his trembling hands. The chat had returned, but the messages were no longer coming from human beings. The screen was filled with long strings of binary code and distorted symbols that defied any known language. In the live feed on his screen, Jackson watched as the door to the room began to open slowly. But as he looked at the physical door in front of him, it remained tightly shut and locked. He watched his own digital image on the screen stand up from the stool and walk out of the room into the dark, charred hallway of the sanatorium. The digital version of Jackson then turned back toward the camera and smiled. It was a smile that was far too wide for a human face, revealing rows of teeth that looked like jagged glass. Jackson felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror wash over him as he realized he had finally found the real scare his audience had been demanding. He had spent so many years performing for a screen, chasing the approval of people he had never met, that the digital world had finally decided to take the performer and leave the man behind. He began to scream, pounding his fists against the reinforced steel door, but the sound did not even produce an echo in the small, oppressive room. He thought about his brother, whom he had pushed away because he thought the channel was more important than family. He thought about the sincerity he had traded for likes and shares, realizing too late that the 18,000 people watching were not his friends. They were spectators at an execution, and he had been the one to provide the rope. At exactly 2:10 a.m., the battery on his high-end phone finally died. The screen went black, and with it, the only source of light in the room vanished, leaving Jackson in a darkness so absolute that he could no longer tell where his body ended and the room began. Back in the city, at the local police station, a frantic call came in at 4:45 a.m. from Jackson's roommate. The roommate had been watching the stream and had seen the feed cut to a horrifying, static image of Jackson's face before the entire channel was deleted from the platform. The authorities were able to track the GPS signal from his backpack to the woods outside Spokane. They found his car parked at the edge of the property, its tires sunk deep into the mud from the late summer rain. When the search party entered Blackwood Manor, they made their way to the third floor. They found his backpack and his gimbal lying on the floor right outside the door to room 309. The heavy steel door was closed, the latch firmly in place. The lead officer took a deep breath and pulled the door open, expecting to find Jackson huddling in the corner. But as the beam of his flashlight swept across the small space, his breath hitched in his throat. The room was completely empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the thick dust, and no Jackson Reed. The only thing they found was a single smartphone lying in the exact center of the floor. Its screen cracked and charred, as if it had been through an intense fire. The lead officer stood in the doorway of room 309, his breathing heavy and ragged as the beam of his flashlight cut through the thick, swirling dust. The space was so small that he could reach out and touch both walls simultaneously, yet it felt as cavernous and cold as a tomb. There was no way out, no windows, and the stone walls were solid, showing no signs of secret passages or structural failure. He looked down at the charred smartphone in the center of the floor. Despite the intense heat that must have been required to melt the casing and blacken the screen, there was not a single scorch mark on the floorboards beneath it. It was as if the fire had come from inside the device itself. The tech forensics team at the Spokane precinct worked for 3 days straight to recover any data from the ruined hardware. When they finally managed to pull the final 30 seconds of the recorded livestream, the entire department gathered around a single monitor in a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. They did not see Jackson being attacked or dragged away. Instead, they saw the view from the corner of the room, looking down at Jackson as he sat on the stool. In the video, the real Jackson was still pounding on the door, his movements frantic and desperate. But then, the door in the video slowly creaked open. A hand reached in from the hallway to pull the door shut from the outside. The hand had 5 fingers, but the skin was not flesh. It was the shifting, flickering color of digital static. As the door in the video clicked shut, the camera panned down to the smartphone lying on the floor. For a brief second, the reflection in the dark screen showed the room was completely full. It was packed with thousands of translucent, flickering figures, all standing shoulder to shoulder, staring down at Jackson with wide, unblinking eyes. They were not there to help him. They were there to consume the moment. The video ended with a single line of text appearing in the chat box from a user with no name. It simply said that the performance was finally satisfactory. Jackson Reed was officially declared a missing person on September 3, 2025, but the case remains one of the most disturbing anomalies in the history of the department. There were no tracks leading away from the sanatorium, and no body was ever recovered from the woods. However, the most unsettling part of the story did not happen at the manor. It happened on the internet. A week after the search was called off, the Urban Decay channel suddenly reappeared online. All of the old videos had been deleted, replaced by a single 24-hour looped live stream of an empty stone room. To this day, if you find that channel and look at the viewer count, it never changes. It is always frozen at 18,404. If you stay on the stream for more than 10 minutes, your own device will begin to run hot, the battery draining in a matter of seconds. Some people claim that if you turn the volume up all the way and filter out the white noise, you can hear the faint, muffled sound of a man pounding on a steel door, his voice hoarse from months of screaming. Others say that if you look closely at the shadows in the corner of the stream, you can see a pair of eyes reflecting the blue light of a screen that never turns off. The hunger for validation is a flame that eventually consumes the very person who fans it, leaving nothing but cold ash in its wake. We often spend our lives building a digital version of ourselves to show the world, forgetting that when we step too far into the light of the screen, we leave our shadows behind to find a life of their own. It is a strange thing to realize that we are the only ones who can truly witness our own lives. When we trade that private reality for the hollow gaze of 1,000 strangers, we might just find that the audience eventually decides to keep the show running long after the performer has disappeared.